Hey, Slater Crusaders, welcome to the show. Happy Thursday. Glad you're here. Coming up in a little bit, we're going to talk to George W. Bush's former speechwriter. He's got a new book about George Washington, but it focuses on the last years of his life, and in particular, the decision he had to make on whether or not to leave the presidency. So not a very frequently covered portion of Washington's life. So looking forward to talk to him about that. But first, we're all going to die. The coronavirus, of course. Be very scared, I'm told, by some people who are very often wrong about everything. Or I should say, I'm told to be very scared by people who get paid by scaring me and people. Because the more outrage, the more fear, the more clicks, and the more money they get. Now listen, I'll start this off with a disclaimer that my thoughts here could be very, very wrong. Like, you could actually die from the coronavirus. I suppose there's a chance of that happening. But that's sort of the humility I'm talking about. Because what you hear from the fearmongers, like, they could also be very, very wrong. So here's my premise now. A couple weeks ago, we talked with John Tierney on the show. He's the science writer for the New York Times. Super smart guy. I don't know if he's a conservative or not necessarily, but super thoughtful. And more importantly here, doesn't get whipped up into a hysterical frenzy with the latest crisis of the day. So he has a new book called The Power of Bad, How the Negativity Effect Rules Us and How We Can Rule It. And he gave us, a couple weeks ago, 3 guidelines when it comes to, something like the coronavirus. The first, the world always seems to be in crisis. Second, it's never as bad as it sounds. And third, the solution could easily make things worse. All right, so we'll run through them. First, the world always seems to be in crisis. I feel like there's always some pandemic that's about to kill us every year or so, right? Do you remember the swine flu, the avian flu, Ebola, Zika, SARS, and now we got this thing. It's always something, yet we're all still here. Charlie Martin wrote a good piece the other day, and he started off saying, I'd like to start this column by asking us all to observe a moment of silence to remember the millions of Americans who died in the great Ebola pandemic of 2014. There was no Ebola pandemic of 2014. But you were also told then to be very, very scared about it. By the way, I should note that they think that this thing, the coronavirus, came from eating bats. So you shouldn't eat bats. You shouldn't do that. You'll probably, if you're in China, you shouldn't, but even here, because you'll probably get rabies. And rabies is even worse than the coronavirus. So don't eat bats, because why would you ever eat a bat? So picture, they think this came from this seafood market in China. And on the menu of this giant Chinese seafood market, and if you've ever been to a Chinese seafood market, it's one of the most horrific places you could possibly imagine ever. Because all the animals are alive. Everything's alive. And you're like, oh, I'll have a turtle or something. And they bring out a turtle alive. And they kill it right in front of you. So on the menu for this seafood market, they had koala bear. Koala bear. Didn't we just send money to Australia to save the koala bears? And now you're telling me people in China are eating them? Well, I didn't get money to save them. But people gave money to save, and that doesn't. So be careful at Chinese seafood markets. You never know what you're going to get. Now, point is, there's always some pandemic that's going to kill us, right? So this is Dr. Eric Feigl-Ding. He's a public health scientist, epidemiologist, health economist, 15 years at Harvard, and Harvard and Johns Hopkins alum. And he wrote this on Twitter, very thoughtful, measured analysis. He wrote, "Holy Mother of God, the new coronavirus is a 3.8. This is thermonuclear pandemic level bad." Good, I'm glad we have very thoughtful, sensible people as epidemiologists at Harvard that have no problem saying, "Holy Mother." That's what you want out of a doctor, right? You're going to go see a doctor, you got some ailment, and the doctor comes in, like, "Hey, doc, how is it?" "Well, Holy Mother of God, this is bad. You are, wow, this is DEFCON 1 for you right now, buddy. So we can break down what that means, 3.8. It's pretty boring, but the short of it is 3.8 is the number of people that they think will be infected in the future from each current case of it. So one person gets coronavirus, they think 3.8 people will then get it from that one person. You want the number less than 1, right? Meaning that it's going to die out on its own. So one person has it, and you think like 0.6 people will get it, right? So it'll decrease over time. That's what that is. Now you're thinking, geez, Slater, that sounds pretty bad. Maybe you shouldn't make fun of this guy. Maybe you should listen to him. He went to Harvard. You didn't. He's an epidemiologist. You're just some stupid talk show host. Well, here's that tweet that we just showed. He sent that out Friday at 8:01 p.m. Okay? Wrote that out, Holy Mother of God, went to bed. Maybe he didn't go to bed because he was panicking so much, freaking out, running through the streets. I don't know what he was doing all night. But by Saturday morning at 10:07 a.m., he wrote, update, transmission of corona estimate now at 2.6, lower than the original 3.8. But 2.6 is still extremely bad. Give it another few days, and well, here we are, still alive. Another post he wrote, he said, so what does this mean for the world? We are now faced with the most virulent virus epidemic the world has ever seen. You know that thing called the plague? That's got nothing on what we're seeing right now. Ridiculous. So the world always seems to be in crisis. That's number one. Number two, it's never as bad as it sounds. So far, it looks like 171 people have died in China, all of them in China, from this so far. The median age, by the way, is 75, worth noting. So a lot of these people are older, probably had lung issues. Like the air quality is not great in China. Either is the bat soup. So that all in China, all 75, 171 people. Listen, I don't want anyone dying, right? But the flu, like the regular flu that goes around every year, kills about 60,000 people in America. So like 400 times as many people and gets no attention. Not 400 more people, 400 times as many people. So you got this thing that kills 171 people, tons of attention nonstop. The flu kills 400 times as many people and it gets no attention. That's weird, right? Like that doesn't die. So that's number two. Number three, maybe the solution is worse than the cure. So this one's tough because I understand taking precautions. China built a 1,000-bed hospital in 6 days to treat people with this virus. The entire city's basically quarantined. And maybe that's important. Maybe that's necessary. I don't know. Maybe that'll save us all, and we should be super grateful for it. But also, this whole thing could be nothing, and that's a really big cost to impose. So I'm not going to criticize their effort to stop the spread. That's not my point. But every emergency crisis like this needs to be run through the John Tierney 3-part system. First, the world will always seem to be in crisis. 2, it's never as bad as it sounds. And 3, solutions could easily make things worse. Also, rule of thumb, my addition, don't eat bats. True story. Mike Slater, spread the word. Hey, Slater Crusaders, I want to talk about some lessons that Democrats have still not learned leading up to the election year. Can you believe is Iowa on Monday? That's crazy. So, still haven't learned the lesson. A lot of lessons, right? The impeachment trial is going to end soon, maybe tomorrow. Trump's not going to be removed from office, as we've said from the very beginning, 100% guaranteed that this was going to be the eventual outcome. So that's going to end with a giant Trump win, right? Big giant acquittal, right? 3 years of Democratic Party Trump derangement syndrome, and they got nothing to show for it. Daniel Greenfield had a great line about this yesterday. He said, the Democrats have spent so much time hoping to remove Trump through the 25th Amendment or Mueller and now impeachment. And he says, as a result, the best bet for taking down Trump has been narrowed down to Biden or Bernie. So they haven't done a great job. We said from the jump that all this is just going to make Trump stronger. And the Dems will never learn. And then on top of that, you got the Don Lemon situation from the other day, proving that they still haven't learned their lesson about insulting Trump voters, calling them deplorables or bitter clingers, or laughing at Trump supporters as a bunch of idiots. They still haven't learned their lesson on that either, yet still preach about how to unite the country and all that, right? And they haven't learned their lesson when it comes to campaigning. Do you know the name Brad Pascal? I think that's how you pronounce it even, Brad Pascal. This guy has a crazy story. He was hired in Trump, Pascal. He was hired by Trump in 2011 to make a couple websites for him, like for the Trump winery. And he just designed the website. And then in 2015, Trump hired him to make the website for his exploratory committee, paid him $1,500 to make like a Wix website, right? Then this whole campaign thing worked out pretty well, right? He gained some steam. So they hired him to be Trump's digital advertising guru, and he absolutely crushed Hillary's team. And now he's Trump's 2020 campaign manager in like no time. And he might be the biggest reason why, or the biggest force, like outside forces, why Trump is president. In the 2016 election, 50% of Trump's media expenditures were spent on digital advertising. 50%. For Hillary, 8%. Huge difference. One of the craziest stories about this, and then we'll move on to today, but one of the craziest stories from the 2016 election is that Facebook offered to give the Clinton and the Trump campaign Facebook employees to embed them inside the campaign. And Pascal said, yeah, I'll take them. I want only the Republicans, though. Give me any Republican Facebook employee you have. And they took them, and they were embedded inside the campaign, and they taught the campaign how to use all the different opportunities and tricks of Facebook to reach as many people as possible, and people that traditional TV media couldn't get to. And they embraced that, the Trump campaign. Hillary's campaign said no. They said, no, we don't want anyone. They didn't take any Facebook employees in and totally missed that boat. So that's an amazing story because Facebook and Twitter, right, obviously created by very leftist people, but was used by Trump's team to win and put a Republican in the White House. Pretty amazing. Pascal, every day, he ran an average of 60,000 ad versions every day. That doesn't even make any sense. How's it possible? So they'd put an ad, they like A/B test ads constantly, I guess. So they'd have an ad, and there's not much you can do with a Facebook ad, right? But they change the design, the color, the background, the picture just a little bit, change the words here and there, the font, the size, all these different things. 60,000 a day, different versions. Some days they'd have as many as 100,000 different ads. I don't even see how that's possible. But I just share that just to see the intense focus that they had on digital advertising and in particular, Facebook advertising. So Trump's team, light years ahead of Hillary's team when it came to digital advertising, and still are. Check this out. This is a tweet from Pascal. He said, "We have excellent data from Milwaukee." There was a Trump rally the other day. 20,395 voters identified. 57.9% were not Republicans. 4,313 registrants didn't vote in 2016. He said on some more, he said, there's another rally in Toledo. He said 22% of supporters at the Toledo rally were Democrats. 21% were independents. In Battle Creek, Michigan, 15% of identified voters who saw the president speak have not voted in any of the last 4 elections. So we can talk about those numbers specifically and what those mean. You know, number of Democrats, independents. They say in Hershey, Pennsylvania, 18% of the people there were non-white, 20% were Democrats, right? So we could talk about all that. But I remember I first saw these numbers. Did you come up with the same thought? I thought, gosh, that's specific. 4,313 registrants didn't vote in 2016. That's a very specific number. Maybe with the percentages, that means you could just ask a certain number of people there and then just extrapolate it for the whole 20,000 people who are there. But that's a specific number. How did they get very, very specific numbers? I'm not 100% certain of this, but I'm guessing it is from geofencing. and I'll tell you why I think this in a second here, but geofencing, just so you know, wherever you go, businesses set up these virtual fences, geofence, to collect data on you. So your phone is full of data about you. The apps you have, the things you like on Facebook, the people you follow on Twitter, the places you go, how often you go, when you wake up and go to sleep, right? All of that is in your phone. And when you walk into a geofenced area, the data is collected and given to someone who pays for it, and then it's used to determine what kind of ads to send you. And the data can also tell people what type of personality you have. Do you remember Cambridge Analytica? Remember that name? So their whole thing was they would figure out your personality, and they had 5 different measurements of your personality. They would rank you and rate you based on agreeableness, neuroticism, openness, extroversion, and conscientiousness. So they would look at your data and they'd say, oh, you like these things on Facebook, you use these apps, you go to these places, so you're probably high on the neuroticism scale. Okay, so what do we do with that if you're a Republican? All right, well, I'm gonna knock on your door, or I'm gonna send you advertising about Second Amendment rights. But not only that, I'm gonna talk to you because you're a little high on the neurotic scale. I'm gonna talk to you about the importance of Second Amendment when it comes to protecting you and your family from criminals. Right? Because that's going to speak to your personality. If you are high on the agree or openness scale, maybe, I'm going to talk to you from a campaign. I'm going to talk to you or send you this particular ad about the Second Amendment, but it's going to be about going hunting with your son, because that's going to speak to you and your personality. That's how detailed this whole thing is. So when they're collecting data, and by the way, read a New York Times article about this, and they made the point that you and I, no way of preventing this from happening, like getting your data collected, and no way to even know that it's happening or when it's happening. It's not like you get an alert that's like, oh, your data's uploading to this guy right now. Like, it's just happening. So I'll give you an example. Brian Birch, president of this group called CatholicVote.org. They said in Wisconsin, they have identified 199,241 Catholics who have been to church at least 3 times in the last 90 days. And they said of that, 91,373 are not registered to vote. A little perspective here. So 91,373. Trump won Wisconsin. Do you know how much Trump won Wisconsin by? 22,000 votes. He barely won Wisconsin. Hillary, by the way, never even went to Wisconsin. So he won by 22,000 votes, and here's this organization saying, we know 91,000 Catholics who go to church who aren't even registered to vote, and now we can access them, encourage them to vote, and get out the vote, right? How did they get that? And again, that's a very specific number. They set up a geofence. Someone walks to church, there's a geofence around the church, collects your data, runs your data through public records, they can find out whether or not you're registered to vote, and they can find out they can find out what party you're on, so whether or not you're registered, what party you're registered with, and if you voted or not. If you voted. They can't find out who you voted for, but they can find out if you voted in the last or previous elections. And then they'll send you ads specifically targeting your preferences and your personalities. Pretty wild, right? It's pretty wild stuff. I don't know what I think about it, to be honest. I don't really love it. Seems a little late, 1940 for me. You can't stop it. So I think it's just important to know it's a thing. But the point of all this is, even after Hillary totally dropped the ball when it comes to this in 2016, it looks like the Democrats are missing it again. They're still not doing it. They thought they could just import a bunch of illegal immigrants to vote and bus old people from the nursing homes. But Trump's team has a huge technological advantage over the Democrats, which is crazy. You'd think the hipster progressives would have it, but it's the MAGA hat rubes who have the edge. Good. True story. Mike Slater. Spread the word. Hey, Slater Crusaders, I found out about this book. I said, I gotta read it, gotta talk to the author, Jonathan Horn. He is a former White House George W. Bush speechwriter, and the new book is Washington's End, The Final Years and the Forgotten Struggle. Mr. Horn, how are you, sir?
Great, thanks for having me today.
I'm so glad you're here. So, obviously, and rightfully so, there's a lot of legend around George Washington. And I remember how distraught I was when I found out he never chopped down a cherry tree. And even like oddly how upset I was when I found out he didn't have wooden teeth. Whatever, right? So I have all these things I think about George Washington, and they all just kept getting crushed. But I think the best legend of George Washington is like the Cincinnatus, president, I don't really want to, like the reluctant leader, and I'm gonna give it up voluntarily and go back to my farm. That's such a beautiful story. Is it true?
Well, on one level, it is true. He really did want to leave the presidency in 1797 at the end of his second term as president. In fact, he wanted to retire after his first term, but people said the country would not hold together unless he served a second. By the time he got to the end of his second, there was no argument that could convince him to serve a third. He was ready to leave. And in March 1797, he left the then capital of Philadelphia and rode back to his farm in Virginia, Mount Vernon. And he really planned to live out his days as a farmer, consumed in what he called rural amusements. And he said he would never venture further than 20 miles again from Mount Vernon. And so he really imagined a peaceful retirement. But the retirement turned out to be anything but peaceful.
So I have no idea what happens next in his life. That's amazing, and that's why I'm glad you wrote the book. Before we get to the but and the rest, I got some quick background questions. So how perilous, right? You said he wanted to maybe retire in the first, but people were like, no, you can't leave, like our country will fall apart. Can you help us understand how perilous the country was to crumbling at that time?
Sure. I mean, and part of it is some of the concerns they had back then echo concerns we have now. They were concerned about the emergence of political parties where they tear the country apart. They were worried about America's relationship with foreign powers. The world was at war. Great Britain and France were the then superpowers. How should America line up in that conflict? They were worried about the press. There were new newspapers. Many of them were partisan newspapers, which were emerging. And they were publishing things that in some cases people thought the word we would use today was fake news. And they were wondering how a republic could survive with all these different pressures. And they were very worried about the existence of the country.
What about George Washington gave people hope and security that they needed him to be the president?
Sure. And George Washington represented this unifying figure, the one man, as Thomas Jefferson put it when he convinced George Washington to serve a second term, that it could hold the country together, that could unite everyone. But by the time he left the presidency in 1797, he didn't really see himself as much as that figure anymore. Even some of the opposition newspapers had begun to attack him personally. His relationships with many members of the opposition party that had begun to emerge had really frayed. And he was in some sense embittered by the attacks he had suffered on his reputation.
Was he actually an ambitious person, or was he truly a reluctant leader, or somewhere in between? How would you describe that?
I think if you go back to George Washington's early life and you look at his character as it shaped up, and this is during the French and Indian War, George Washington, and one of the reasons, by the way, I should tell your listeners, that George Washington's life you so rarely hear about his last years is because he did so much before his last years. He was in the French and Indian War. He was, of course, our commander during the American Revolution. He presided over the Constitutional Convention, and he served 2 terms as president. So there's not a lot of room when the biographer gets to the last years, even though they are quite action-packed. But you do see a strain of ambition. He has a desire to make a name for himself in life. He sees himself having a great destiny, and he is ambitious. At the same time, part of his ambition is to be the American Cincinnatus, to have power and to ride away from power. And that was the image he aspired toward. And so surrendering power, he understood, was a very important part of his legacy. And he was very keen to carry out that part of his legacy.
Interesting. The way you say that is almost as if he planned on it that way a long time. It wasn't like just something he realized at the end. He had intentions to do that?
Absolutely. He always envisioned himself giving up power. He did it, had done it during the American Revolution. And that at the time was one of the most notable scenes in history. And there's a reason why everyone, when he did it, was so amazed, because you have to understand, if you go back to that time in history, it was a period of time when victorious generals and heads of state really only gave up power if they lost their lives. And here is a man who's voluntarily giving up power in the image of the Roman general Cincinnatus, who famously saved the Roman Republic, only to return to his farm afterwards.
Wow. So what do you think, why do you think he found that so noble? Like, I do now, but I think it's because I know the George Washington story, right? But as you said, in the context, maybe it wasn't seen as a noble thing. So why did he see it as so noble?
Well, it's important to say that Americans broadly thought that was a noble ideal. The American people widely looked to Cincinnatus as a hero. It was just the question of, could someone do that today? And George Washington was that man. We have a story, and we can't totally confirm it, that when King George III heard that George Washington was going to give up power, he said, well, if he does that, he'll be the greatest man who ever lived. And that's because giving up power is really difficult. And I think today we take it for granted because the term former president has become so common sounding. We don't even think anything of it. But there really was no living precedent for what George Washington was planning to do when he did ride away from the presidency in March 1797.
Wow, that's amazing. What did John Adams think about it?
Well, we have these great accounts of John Adams watching his own inauguration and sort of writing what he saw. And one of the things he notices is that everybody is crying, they have tears in their eyes. But he realizes that the tears aren't because he's taking office. The tears are because George Washington is leaving office. And, he has a very difficult act to follow. And everybody knows they're witnessing history at this moment when John Adams takes power. But it's not really about John Adams taking power. It's about George Washington leaving power.
Yeah. I got one more background question before we move forward. You talked about would you say rural sensibilities? Is that the word you talked about, or rural amusements?
I didn't say that very clearly. I apologize. Rural amusements.
No, I forgot. Rural amusements. So
loved farming. He had a passion for farming. It was the way he saw himself. He said that was his true calling in life, to be a farmer.
Why? So where was the nobility in that for him?
I think he liked to see the fruits of his labor, and he also was he was a rather innovative farmer. He liked to test new things. He liked to test new crops. He was very interested in the latest developments in Britain, which at that time was the more advanced agricultural society. And so he was very keen to sort of help the American people become more productive farmers and use land better. And he wanted Mount Vernon to be an example of that.
Does he have Thomas Jefferson, his tombstone, it doesn't say anything about being president, right? So George Washington, where would he have ranked being president in his biography?
Well, I think that's a good question. I think it was obviously a very monumental role for George Washington to be the first president. I'm not sure I can exactly answer that. But in terms of how he saw himself, he liked to say he saw himself as a farmer, which is why he constantly felt this urge to return to Mount Vernon. But at the same time, he saw himself as a farmer, but he also had built this country in a way that's difficult for us to understand, because there's no one person in America today who can look at the country and say it's really their legacy. So it's very difficult, if you think about it, to take your hand off the wheel of the ship of state after you're the person who set it afloat.
Okay, I lied. One last background question. What do you think? I'm so fascinated by the idea that his tombstone could read, "Here lies George Washington, farmer, ... father of America, president of the United States." Right. What do you think?
Done that way, right?
Yeah. What do you think it was about farming that made him good at his role that we best know him as, president and general and all that? What do you think he learned on the farm?
That's actually a really great question. I'm glad you asked that. I think it was because he had a systematic mind. And people who saw him running his farm said he ran it like an army. And of course, he did use, we should say, he did have, of course, slaves working on his farm, and he expected something from everybody, and he kept very accurate reports of exactly what he was getting from various different people on the farm, from the productivity of each of his farms. Because Mount Vernon, to put it into perspective, is not a little farm like we might imagine today as a quaint little place. It was gigantic. It was actually really 5 separate farms that were connected, and it was a massive operation. And the total estate was almost 8,000 acres, if you can imagine that. So it was quite a large place. This was a massive undertaking, and it required command. And when he was during his presidency, he devoted one day of every week to looking over reports from Mount Vernon of what was happening at the farm and as farms. And these were extremely detailed reports. And then he would write back extremely detailed letters giving his orders for the farm. And he felt frustrated, though, because he knew he could do a better job commanding his farms, as we might say, if he was actually at Mount Vernon. And when he returned home, he did spend multiple hours during the day riding around his farms, observing what was happening, and trying to bring them into a sense of order. They were never terribly profitable farms.
So he was still farming when he was in the White House? That's unbelievable. I never thought that. Jonathan, do you mind? Could we take a quick break? We haven't even gotten to the book yet. Can you do one more quick segment? We could talk about the rest of his life.
Absolutely. Let's do that.
Jonathan Horn, former White House speechwriter, Washington's End, The Final Years of the Forgotten Struggle. It's available for pre-order right now, and it's going to be released in about 2 weeks on February 11th. So go buy this. We'll talk more with Jonathan next. True story, Mike Slater. Spread the word. Slater, thanks for sticking around. Jonathan Horn's here, former White House speechwriter, George W. Bush. I had some questions about that. I don't know if we'll ever even get to that. But he's got a new book, Washington's End, The Final Years in the Forgotten Struggle. Okay, Jonathan, you've been super patient with me and my background questions. Let's get to the but, right? So you said he wanted to go back to the farm, wanted to do the Cincinnatus thing, and he did, but then, and what happened?
Well, so just a little bit more than a year later, after returning to Mount Vernon, he found himself called back out of retirement when he was nominated to be commander-in-chief of all the armies of the United States. Amid a war scare with France, there was serious concern that the United States was going to go to war with France. There were some people who thought the French might actually invade the United States. George Washington himself just couldn't really see that happening because of the logistical challenges. But there was enough of a scare that the United States began building what became known as a new army. And they wanted George Washington to take command. So he did take that title of commander-in-chief. And that really is, when you think about it, the most awesome title our republic can bestow upon anyone. And of course, the president, under the Constitution, is technically commander-in-chief. And it wasn't long until George Washington and his successor, John Adams, were in a serious feud.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I'm so ignorant about this. So it's so funny. I didn't even realize what a blind spot I had in my history here and my George Washington knowledge. So he was president, which was commander-in-chief, and then he left and then was named commander-in-chief?
That's exactly. Commander-in-chief of the armies of the United States was the title he was given by John Adams, who nominated him for command of the armies at a time when people were worried the United States might have to go to war with France. France had been raiding American ships, and then France basically refused to receive envoys who the United States had sent to France to negotiate a settlement. And you may have heard of that. That became known as the XYZ affair, which became a very scandalous incident and sent America into war furor. And there was a military buildup that took place. And of course, when there's a military buildup, who do you look to? Well, you're Cincinnatus sitting back in Mount Vernon. You call him out of retirement. And so there was a choice for Washington. Would he accept this command? And he was worried. He was worried. What would people say? Would they say that his entire everything he had previously said about wanting to return to Mount Vernon and live out his days as a farmer, would they say that was a lie? Would they say he couldn't be happy in retirement? And he was also worried about something else. If he took this command and it didn't go well, would he injure his reputation? The legacy he had built, which was the most important thing he had, was his public reputation. He cared so much about that. And so he put a condition on his acceptance. He said he would accept, but only if he could choose his subordinate general officers. He wanted to basically to be able to pick his second in command. So he would have the people in place to help him. And after some thought, the person he decided he wanted to be his second in command was Alexander Hamilton. And it just so happened, one person, John Adams, did not want to be second in command of this army, Alexander Hamilton. And so the president and General Washington had a serious feud over whether this could happen.
Okay, you mentioned his legacy. I was going to ask you right before you said that, how much of George Washington's decision-making did he consider external people, right? And what people thought about him versus what he thought internally was the best thing and the right thing to do?
Right. And so he said, basically, if I see the country is in danger, I can't possibly stay back in Mount Vernon. That would violate everything I believe. I would have a duty. But to say he didn't care what people were going to say would not be a correct understanding of George Washington. He cared a ton about what people would say about him. He very much cared about his reputation. It really was one of the things he valued most. And at this point in his life, and really much before, to an astonishing amount, he understood that everything he said, everything he wrote would enter into the history books. And one of the things he wanted to be spending his time doing at Mount Vernon was actually going through his old papers and setting up an archive because he knew historians were going to come for them, and he was very conscious of it. And actually, the accounts we have of Washington at Mount Vernon often describe him, even at his own dinner table, as being careful of what he said, because he knew any comment could live on in history. If you have dinner with George Washington, you might write down what George Washington said. You might send a letter, you might put it in your diary, and it might make its way into the newspapers or into history books. It might never go.
Yeah, that would be exhausting. That sounds terrible.
Right. So it takes a man of extreme self-control to be able to inhabit that role. And George Washington was the man for that job.
Did he, so real quick, how did that story end with him being the commander-in-chief of the armies? Did he voluntarily give that up too?
No, so what ended up happening was, as I said, Adams tried to stop Hamilton from being second in command. And of course, under the Constitution, that is the president's choice to select officers. But Washington basically then suggests to Adams, I will resign my commission in the Army unless I get the second in command that I wish to have. And Adams has no choice at that point but to give way and to give Washington the second in command he wishes. And it's at that point, shortly afterward, that Adams will begin pursuing a new round of negotiations with France. Because he begins to think that this army is almost more of a threat to the United States than the threat from France.
Wow.
And I should say, as we're talking about the feud between Adams and Washington, Washington had even worse feuds with many of the other future presidents, Thomas Jefferson and James Monroe, to name two of them. He had very serious feuds with them during these last years. He wasn't even speaking with them, essentially. Or at all. That it's just interesting to think about our first president, basically, when he died in 1799, being on such bad terms with the second, third, fourth, and fifth presidents of the United States.
Wow. So that's amazing. When he did pass away, what did those guys, number 2, 3, 4, and 5, say about him? Or were they like, do you think they're like, good riddance, that guy was whatever? Or did they come back to proper?
Well, I think John Adams understood he had a role as president to help the country mourn. And I think he was personally moved by George Washington having died. They had served together for many, many years, going back to the Continental Congress. And so he understood the importance of the moment. That said, when the mourning went on for a certain length of time, he'd get a little bit sick of it and said, it's time, we've done enough eulogies, let's move on. Thomas Jefferson, for his part, took a long time to send any letter and make any official statement on the death of George Washington. He made some private notes about it, but it wasn't until much later that he came actually to visit Martha Washington at Mount Vernon and pay his condolences to her. And when he did come, Martha basically considered it a political act, that Jefferson was just coming to further his own political career, and she considered it one of the worst moments of her entire life, having to receive Thomas Jefferson at Mount Vernon under those circumstances.
Unbelievable. I think of that because, people talk about the political rancor of today, and we look back and I think we romanticize the past as just a big kumbaya, but that doesn't seem to be the case.
No, absolutely. And I should mention one more of these views because we're talking about George Washington's death. And George Washington had an especially terrible feud with James Monroe, who had served as George Washington's minister to France. And George Washington had recalled James Monroe because he was not happy with the way Monroe was conducting himself in France. And then Monroe came back to the United States and he wrote essentially what amounted to a tell-all book attacking George Washington's administration. And Washington...
Like John Bolton. He was the John Bolton of 1780.
So much of this stuff resonates in the past, and Washington actually goes through this book and he annotates it with really angry annotations attacking Monroe. And the night before Washington dies, he actually reads a newspaper article about a speech that James Madison has given in favor of having James Monroe elected as the governor of Virginia, and it sends Washington into an angry fit. Where his private secretary has to calm him down. And so that's one of the last things that happens during Washington's life is that disappointing news that Monroe will become governor of Virginia.
Wow, this is so amazing how you've brought these like mythical characters down to humanity for me. But like that also makes them even more impressive in ways.
Yes, and
I think that's a key point. Go ahead, please. We got about 2 minutes, but go ahead.
Oh, sorry. I think that's a really key point because we're talking about this. And I think in some ways you might say, does this lessen your opinion of George Washington? And it's just the opposite. For me, seeing how difficult it was to surrender power gave me all the more respect for George Washington because once you realize how difficult it was, you can see what greatness he had that he was able to do it.
Yes. How would you say George Washington's personality or character or vision of life, you go wherever you want with it, changed maybe from earlier in his career to later in his life?
Well, that's a great question. One of the things that's interesting is, of course, in his famous farewell address, he warns against the spirit of party, and he says, he makes clear it would be better if there were no political parties. But by the end of his life, he basically has concluded that events have reached such a point that everyone either has to be a member of one party or another party, and that includes himself. And it's a very sad note to read from Washington as he explains his logic, that there's basically no choice. Everyone in public life has to be one thing or the other, including himself. And even he no longer feels he can transcend this divide.
Oh, wow, no one hears about that letter. We always hear about that first one, the speech, and never the letter afterwards.
Absolutely, and so this is an amazing document.
Last question. What surprised you the most in your research?
What surprised me most was just seeing how difficult it was to surrender power and being reminded of all the forces and personalities trying to lure Washington back out of retirement. But as I said, I came away with even greater respect for the man.
Great stuff. Jonathan Horn, Washington's End, The Final Years, The Forgotten Struggle. Pre-order right now, and it's going to be out on February 11th. Sir, congratulations on writing this, and thank you. I look forward to reading it.
Thanks so much for having me today. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Jonathan Horn. Great stuff. Is that the show? We got to go. All right. We'll see you tomorrow then. True story. Mike Slater, spread the word.